When it comes to chess, both Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi are widely regarded as the best chess players in the world. Magnus, well, is still the undoubted champion. On the other hand, Ian is currently the world's #1 opponent. The animosity between the two competitors goes back to when they were kids. Magnus and Ian were born around the same time in the early 90s, and fate brought them together at a chess match when they were just 10 years old, from where they became close buddies. Comparing Ian to Magnus is like comparing apples and oranges. Magnus's international flair has made him famous. He can easily play anywhere on the field and is nearly impossible to defeat. Oppositely, Ian is famous for his bold and methodical playstyle. He aims to make things difficult and win matches by taking the offensive. Talking about the showdown between these two is like one of the most intense rivalries in the chess world. They're like the yin and yang of the chessboard, always pushing each other to the limit. In this video today, we will discuss the match that just took place between these two in the Global Chess Championship 2023. Let's get started. The match full of roller coaster of emotions. Ian chose the king's pawn approach to kick off the match, and Magnus responded by using the Sicilian defense. The game immediately switched to the Alpine variation of the Sicilian defense once the first few moves were made. Eventually, Magnus leveled up both of his knights, and Ian used his knight and bishop to set off a strike. Next, Ian tried to attack Magnus' king with a knight surrender using the fried liver attack. Magnus slipped his pawn to d5 to deter him. After that, there was an exchange where Ian might have played boldly by risking the knight on f3. But every person knows it's tough to confront Magnus in a position like that. So he played pawn to d4, giving Magnus an unrestricted pawn, and Magnus took him up immediately. The next great position Ian uncovered was the queen to b3, which allowed an X-ray to be created over the lateral. Magnus used his bishop to protect it. Then Ian's knight took the bishop, but Magnus was able to recapture it with his pawn. This led to Ian capturing the piece at position b7, severely weakening Black's stance. Unfortunately, Magnus's situation seemed bad at this moment. His body language appeared to be strong, and his expression swung wildly. The clever steps and fumbles. After Ian successfully defended his king in a castle, Magnus decided to up the stakes with a risky offer, a swap of queens. However, Ian made an error by turning down the deal, as it opened the door for Magnus to establish his castle on Ian's king's side. The atmosphere in the space became tense again after a few steps had been taken. Magnus took the risky step of capturing the knight on c3. Rather than recapturing with his knight, Ian decided to trade queens on move d7. Ian proposed a rook exchange after a few turns had passed. Magnus decided to give it a shot. However, Ian gave up his knight in exchange for a bishop, and now both players owned a rook and a bishop. For Magnus to capture the pawn on h2, Ian moved his rook to position a7. Ian then moved his rook to a5, where he captured the pawn. Magnus began to advance his pawn, and after exchanging pawns on h4, he successfully made a passed pawn. Ian made an incredible move by checking with his rook and then relocating it to h7 to stop this pawn from advancing. It was a mistake, but Magnus still advanced his pawn to the h3 square. Magnus the Invincible wins the game. The intention underlying this move was that Magnus would make a check with his rook and devour Ian's rook if Ian seized this pawn. Ian noticed all of this, but he was unable to determine a counterattack. Instead of taking the pawn on e6 with the bishop, which would have seemed optimal, Ian decided to move his king to d4. Magnus defended the passing pawn by sliding his rook to c2, and Ian saw an advantageous move when he took the bishop to e6. Unfortunately, it was already far too late. Magnus made a superb play here, checking with the bishop, checking with the rook, and finally sliding his pawn to h2. There was no longer any way to avert this pawn from being advanced. With rook and bishop, though, Ian gave it his best go. Magnus gave up his rook on move f3 to advance to queen. Ian quickly jumped at the chance to devour the bishop. From this vantage point, it was clear that Magnus would come out victorious. Magnus gave a handful of checks, then pinned White's king in a corner, blocking Ian's advance. Ian saw that fighting was pointless, so he resigned graciously and gave up, giving the victory to Magnus despite his best efforts. That's all for this video. Leave your thoughts on this moment. Also, take a minute out and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned. See you soon.